A lawful gun owner was killed, and that changed everything. On January 24th, 2026, in Minneapolis, Alex Pretti was shot and killed by immigration agents during an altercation while he was lawfully carrying a firearm. He was 37 years old, and almost immediately the story stopped being about what happened in that moment and started becoming a test of something much bigger. Because here's the contradiction. An administration that brands itself as the strongest defender of the Second Amendment didn't pause, didn't investigate publicly, and didn't hedge. It moved fast to justify the killing and to reframe lawful gun carry as suspicious behavior. Now personalize that for a second. If lawful carry can be turned into evidence of danger after you're already dead, when does a right stop protecting you? But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. This wasn't chaos, it was control. And once the narrative hardens that quickly, it's no longer just about one man in Minneapolis. It's about who the state protects next and who it decides doesn't count. The official story began forming almost immediately, but only part of it was visible. The core event is simple on the surface. An immigration enforcement operation ends with a civilian dead. The man killed is later described in headlines as a Good Samaritan who was lawfully armed. Federal agents say the shooting was justified. But notice how little detail was initially offered about the sequence of decisions that led to lethal force. Instead of treating this as an isolated use of force incident, the administration framed it as something more familiar and more convenient, a law enforcement encounter where danger was assumed. That framing matters because it places the burden of explanation on the civilian, not the state. Now watch the pattern. This isn't the first time a crisis involving federal power is handled by narrowing the question. Not should this have happened, but why the victim made it inevitable. And once that framing takes hold, every detail becomes evidence pointing in one direction. Here's the cognitive trap. If lawful behavior can be reinterpreted after the as threatening, then the definition of lawful itself becomes flexible. So the real question isn't just what happened in Minneapolis, it's why the response was so fast, so unified, and so unwilling to leave space for doubt. The administration made a clear calculation, and then it acted on it. The claim was simple and forceful. Alex Pretti was not just armed, he was dangerous. That argument showed up almost immediately through concrete details. Officials emphasized that he was carrying a firearm and an extra magazine. Not that he fired it, not that he threatened anyone, just that he had it. Here's why that matters. In most public gun debates, possession is neutral. It's either legal or illegal. But in this case, possession itself was presented as proof of intent. The suggestion was subtle but powerful. A person who carries more than the minimum must be planning something. Notice what's missing. There was no early focus on verbal warnings, distance, or de-escalation attempts. No detailed timeline released to explain how seconds turned into gunfire. Instead, attention was pulled toward equipment, not actions. That shift does important work. If the equipment is the threat, then the agent's response becomes automatic. And if the response is automatic, it no longer needs moral or legal scrutiny. This is where the story flips. Because once preparedness is reframed as malice, the debate isn't about mistakes anymore. It's about whether certain people are allowed to be armed at all, depending on who's watching. The situation didn't just settle into controversy, it escalated. As the public debate widened, the argument quietly shifted from one shooting to a broader rule about behavior. The message wasn't limited to Minneapolis anymore. It started sounding like guidance. If you are armed and you approach federal law enforcement, lethal force may be justified. That framing has a precedent, not a distant one, but a familiar one. After past crises, authorities have often expanded rules of engagement first, then defended them later. What once required a clear threat becomes normalized as a precaution. And once that happens, the exception stops looking like an exception. Now watch how fast this becomes routine. Lawful carry, once treated as neutral, is recast as inherently risky in the presence of the state. The burden quietly shifts. It's no longer on the government to prove danger, it's on the citizen to prove harmlessness. Here's why that detail changes everything. If the mere presence of a firearm is enough to justify preemptive force, then legality stops being protection. it becomes conditional. And when something that should alarm people starts being discussed calmly, that's when normalization sets in. Because the next step isn't debate, it's repetition. The evidence didn't soften the story, it hardened it. As officials continued defending the agents, the contradiction became impossible to miss. On one hand, the administration publicly positions itself as pro-Second Amendment. On the other, it leaned into an argument that common gun carry practices signaled nefarious intent. The same behavior praised in campaign rhetoric was treated as a warning sign in practice. Look closely at what was emphasized: an extra magazine, readiness. Not an aggressive act, not a verbal threat. The logic was clear, preparation itself was suspicious. And that logic only works if you quietly redefine what lawful means in real time. Here's the line that permanently changes how this story reads. The administration didn't argue that Pretti broke the law. It argued that exercising the law made him dangerous. That's not a messaging accident, that's a strategic choice. Because if lawful carry remains legitimate, the killing demands accountability. But if lawful carry becomes morally suspect, the accountability disappears. Notice what they didn't deny. They didn't deny he was legally armed. They didn't deny he was a civilian. They focused entirely on why being prepared was reason enough. And once that logic is accepted, it doesn't stay confined to this case. It becomes a template. Then the pressure started stacking fast. First, the focus narrowed to defending the agents at all costs. Then came the broader statements that sounded less like explanations and more like warnings. If armed civilians approach law enforcement, the risk of lethal force rises. Almost immediately, that idea began circulating as common sense rather than an extreme position. At the same time, gun rights organizations reacted, but selectively. They condemned specific legal interpretations coming from federal prosecutors, but they avoided direct confrontation with the White House. That hesitation mattered because silence at the top left the broader narrative untouched. Now add the speed. Messaging rolled out across agencies, not days later, but almost simultaneously. Homeland Security officials, federal law enforcement voices, even figures usually distant from use of force controversies. The signal was clear. Close ranks, don't fracture, don't pause. This is where control starts slipping, because when multiple institutions rush to lock in one explanation, they leave no room for correction, no room for nuance, no room for trust to rebuild. What happens if this continues? Because pressure doesn't just disappear. It breaks something. Now shift the frame, because this is where it stops being abstract. Imagine this from your side. You're not an activist. You're not trying to provoke anyone. You're just present. You're lawfully armed. Maybe you step forward during a chaotic moment. Maybe you think you're helping, and suddenly the very thing you were told keeps you protected becomes the reason your actions are read as a threat. That's the quiet impact of this case. It doesn't just affect policy debates in Washington. It changes how ordinary people calculate risk in real time. Do you intervene or stay back? Do you comply instantly or hesitate? Do you assume the law protects you or that it might be used against you after the residents in Minneapolis reported feeling fear after the shooting? Not just fear of crime, but fear of misinterpretation. Fear that intent no longer matters if appearance decides everything. And this isn't about ideology. Strip that away. What's left is uncertainty. When rules feel flexible and outcomes feel final, people retreat, they disengage. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because when people stop trusting how power will read their actions, behavior changes. And that's when systems start producing outcomes no one planned for. What allows this to happen isn't chaos, it's incentives. At the system level, the logic is consistent. When federal authority feels exposed, it tightens. When an armed civilian intersects with federal enforcement, the priority becomes preserving institutional legitimacy, not weighing individual context. That's why the response focused less on the encounter itself and more on redefining the environment around it. Rights in this framework are not erased, they're conditional. They exist on paper, but their real-world application depends on whether they interfere with operational control. When they do, the system reframes the behavior as risky, irresponsible, or suspect. This is why the messaging felt so coordinated. Multiple agencies moving in the same direction reduces uncertainty for agents in the field. It sends a signal upward and downward at the same time. Protect the institution first. Here's the unsettling insight. This isn't about guns alone. It's about how power reacts when challenged by ambiguity. And ambiguity is exactly what lawful civilian action creates in high-control environments. Once that tension exists, the system resolves it the same way every time, by narrowing who is allowed to act. From here, the story splits, but both paths move fast. One path is containment. The administration holds the line, gun groups absorb the discomfort, and the issue fades without formal resolution. No apology, no reversal, just a quiet understanding that lawful carry comes with new, unspoken boundaries near federal power. On paper, nothing changes. In practice, behavior does. The other path is erosion. Motivation drops. Trust thins. Organizers disengage. Not because they switch sides, but because enthusiasm is harder to summon after watching a lawful carrier redefined as a threat. Turnout doesn't collapse, it softens. And in polarized elections, softening is enough. Notice the uncertainty. There's no clean break, no dramatic realignment. Just momentum building quietly in one direction or the other. The next move isn't a law or a ruling. It's how many people decide this was tolerable. Because once a coalition accepts one exception, the system learns something. It learns how far it can go next. And the signals forming now suggest the decision isn't finished yet. This story was never just about one shooting. It's about what happens when a right survives rhetorically but collapses operationally. Alex Pretti was described as a lawful carrier. The state's response treated that status as irrelevant once federal authority felt threatened. That gap between what is promised and what is enforced is where trust erodes. Here's the reframing that ties it together. Power doesn't usually announce when it's changing the rules. It tests them in moments of stress, then watches the reaction. The reaction here wasn't unity or outrage, it was hesitation. And hesitation tells systems they still have room to maneuver. The loop forward is already open. This won't be the last case where lawful action collides with institutional self-protection. The only unknown is how visible the next one will be, and how prepared people are to recognize the pattern when it happens again. If you want to keep understanding how these moments actually work beneath the headlines, follow and subscribe. Because the most important shifts rarely look dramatic when they start. They look reasonable.